So philosophy, and I'm trying to make philosophy fun today, this morning, and it is pretty much the last of the theory of the whole 2 days. This afternoon it gets a lot more fun and participatory, so I hope you'll bear with me. But I think it is quite important to go through this and nail down the theory a little bit more. By the way, can everyone hear okay? Is it all loud enough? Fine. They say that sort of philosophy is just asking a lot of smart questions, and that much is true because I've never actually heard a smart answer yet. But a few questions I'd like to ask, and we've had the science this morning, and now philosophy falls in its rightful place. It follows the science, I suppose. And one question I'd like to ask is that if we really are co-creating, as Lynne has demonstrated to us that indeed we are, why is the world such a mess? Why do we have the most appalling atrocities taking place in the world on a daily basis and have done almost since man first took breath? I think that's a reasonable question to ask. And I will try to answer that as well as later on. I suppose it all boils down to the age-old question, which is, who am I? Which was one of the slides that Lynne showed. By the way, you'll notice due to lack of state funding that I don't have a PowerPoint presentation, but that's how far philosophy has descended. Who am I? It's an age-old question. It's been asked by both sides of the globe, by the ancient Greeks on the Western side, and more recently, anyone familiar with the work of the Indian sage Ramana Maharshi said that if you could answer that question, you will answer every question. It is the core question. And of course, it's relevant to intention, because who is actually intending, and what are you intending for? And these, I think the lady sort of raised that as one of the questions earlier today. So again, I want to sort of answer that question. A very, very quick tour through philosophy. Bear with me 2 minutes. There isn't a lot to say. It's quite interesting, although it is the most fundamental of questions, and it's the one we must answer in the short time that we are alive, and we have the privilege of asking and hopefully answering that question. It is a vital question. Surprisingly, philosophy never has really come up with a coherent answer to that question, despite asking it for now 2,500 years. And I think there are two reasons for that. One is because really since the dawn of Western civilization, we've had Christianity, and we've rather satisfied ourselves with the concept that we are a soul that will return to heaven. And then more recently, with the rise of science, I suppose we've now accepted that we are nothing but a series of neurological responses within a body that will eventually die, which is a desperately sad place to find ourselves, but this is roughly where we are right now. But who am I? Plato said we're eternal souls, and that it's simply that we have forgotten that we are eternal souls, and we only have to relearn that. And it seemed to satisfy everyone for about, I don't know, 1,500 years. And then with the rise of science, which I suppose with Newton and then people like Boyle in the 16th century, arose a new branch of philosophy called empiricism. Empiricism is the father of modern science, which says that we get everything through sense data. And one of the early empiricists was John Locke, who said that actually we're just memory. That's all we are, we're just memory. This was actually refuted by another gentleman who said, well, if we're just memory, how come we can't remember things? So are you sure that's right? John Locke, by the way, just as a funny aside here, poor old John Locke, he was a wonderful philosopher. He used to meet down the pub every Sunday night with his intellectual friends. And he said, look, I've been doing some work over the week, and here's something for you to consider. It's my philosophy. And they looked it over their pints of beer, and they said, well, that's interesting, John, but that's wrong, and that's wrong, and that's wrong. And John Locke said, a bugger. So off he went, And he said, I'll give that another go. It took John Locke 12 further years to come back with his masterpiece. But again, one of his central messages was about the self being memory, and it was a reverend who actually pointed out that that can't be right, and John Locke said, bugger. After Locke, we had David Hume, who was the greatest empiricist of them all, who said that there is nothing but sensation, and he said that all of the self is merely ephemeral. It is as a more modern philosopher said, it's a ghost in the machine. There is no self at all. It's an illusion. It's just built up through nerve endings. And that's pretty much where we've been left. And as I say, it's a desperately sad place to be. But of course, people like Richard Dawkins would say that, but that is the truth of the matter. And it's all very well, have these lovely intention workshops, but it's all utter nonsense. We know it's not utter nonsense because on a weekly basis we are proving otherwise. So what, in fact, is going on? Well, one of the key parts of this is the remarkable work of Lynne, who has demonstrated, and indeed we have the equations to prove it, that there is a thing called the zero-point field. It's a unified field that unites all of us. Now, how does that sit with this self and this field? There seems to be a missing ingredient here. The gears are not meshing well. And especially when you start looking at some of the other remarkable evidence out there. Again, they say none of this is true, but it is all true. That there is evidence for telepathy. There is evidence for ESP. There is a remarkable body of evidence for remote viewing. Remote viewing is a fascinating area. If you believe nothing else, believe remote viewing. The CIA have paid thousands for the studies that have carried out. People have been given map coordinates, and sitting in their chair, they have walked mentally into secure buildings, walked down corridors, opened filing cabinets, opened the files, revealed what's in the files, put the file back, closed the cabinet, and returned to their seat and said, this is what's in that file, and they're right. Once, when the CIA was about to end the funding, they actually did a bit of a trick. They gave the coordinates of a very secure base in the United States. And this excellent remote viewer did exactly what he was asked to do and saw the files. Only 3 people in the world knew what was in those files. The remote viewer was the 4th. So when you're faced with things like this, and I've also near-death experiences again, remarkable stories of people literally dead for up to 4 minutes on the hospital bed, having then revived, said, oh, by the way, you'll find a pen up in the gutter of the hospital. And wondering how he possibly could have known that, and wondering what medication to put him on. They did eventually take a look up on the roof, and there was indeed the pen that he said you will see. There are many, many cases of this. And I'm not talking about the white light stuff here. I'm talking about physical things that could be verified. They are there for everyone to see. And I think it's an enormous disservice of science that they will not explore these areas. It's a disservice to mankind that they don't. But nonetheless, they are so. Now, that being the case, as Lynne said, it's obvious that our minds are not harnessed into our bodies. Mind is separate from body. And I think there is sufficient evidence to demonstrate this. But the problem I had was figuring out how all this worked together. Because if we have the mind that is not the body, and I have the zero-point field as well, I just couldn't make this work. It didn't make sense to me. But then very little does, so that's probably no great wonder. But then a light bulb came on, a full 20-watt light bulb, and I said, well, of course, the problem is, whilst we see ourselves as one entity, it just doesn't work. But we are not one entity. You know, you go down the supermarket, get 3 for 1. Well, God had the same idea in mind when he created you. He created 3 of you. And I've got all the notes here, and I do hope you find time to read this. Now, this is a theory, or if you prefer, it's a spiritual map, whichever way you want to look at it. I think it's helpful, I hope it's helpful. But there would seem to be 3 energy centers that you actually are. The first is you're an animal energy center. That's fairly obvious. No one's going to dispute that. Richard Dawkins not going to cuff me around the head for that one. We are a body. We are a second energy center, and that is the emotional center. That is the single most important and interesting center of the 3, and I'm going to spend some time talking about that in a moment. And the third is that we are consciousness. We are zero-point energy. And we are all those 3 things. Now let's just talk about each of those in a little bit more detail. Let's start with the animal one. At the basic level, it's fairly clear, isn't it? The energy needs to eat, it needs to sleep, and so forth and so on. I think that's indisputable, not a problem at all. There are several interesting things about the animal energy center, which I do want to touch on, though. Obviously, the brain, which is in 3 parts, reptilian, mammalian, and neocortex. The neocortex part is the birth of the conceptual mind. Now, the conceptual mind is a most remarkable device because it creates things within time and space and uses time and space to create other things outside of it. It is a remarkable, remarkable thing. That is why we have a world, because of the neocortex and its functioning. There's also something quite remarkable about the animal energy center, and that is this. It actually creates time and space. Now, I have to go back to a little bit of philosophy here, and the blessed Immanuel Kant. And it's interesting, when Lynne started her investigations with the quantum physicists, they kept saying, read Kant. Well, that is almost an act of cruelty. Nobody can read Immanuel Kant. He created his own lexicon, his own dictionary, and then he proceeded to misuse it throughout the book for Critique of Pure Reason. It is an extraordinary work. If you really have a dull weekend, try and have a go at it. But one of the most important things that he explained was in response to the empiricists. We'd said, well, everything's just empirical data, we take it all in. And he said, well, yeah, that's absolutely right. It must be so, but there must be something before that. And that's something before that. For that to happen, there must be time and space. Now, if that happens before it, where does that come from? And also, why, if it's all sense data coming in, are we so familiar and comfortable with the world? This is a very simple précis. But his conclusion was that we create time and space. We are time and space machines, and this body is a space and time suit. The only other thing I'd say, we talked briefly about the conceptual mind. I should just also say, as Lynne pointed out, intelligence runs entirely through the body. Intelligence is not brain-centered. If you ever desire to go to the toilet in a hurry, you'll soon know where intelligence sits. The brain takes no further part. It was like we had in Chicago, you'll be doing this later, about messages in a bottle. And this character came up with barbecue. And we asked, well, interesting, why did you come up with barbecue? He said, well, because I was incredibly hungry. So when we're very hungry, or we have any great bodily need, that will take over from the brain. So intelligence runs through the body. Now, as I said, the most important one to understand is the emotional body. Because, sages and gurus talk about freedom and so forth. There's only one freedom, and that is freedom from the emotional body. Now, the emotional body, it's arises pretty much at birth, and there are many theories as to why it does and what it does. But certainly the early separation from the mother is certainly one very early example, and is probably our very first sense from feeling ourselves part of a unified whole to being separate. That is the first time that occurs, and that is one of the most crushing and the most profound experiences that the emotional body suffers, and it informs you for the rest of your life, and it's not true. But there we are. The emotional body fundamentally is the past. The animal center doesn't have a problem with the past. It lives totally in the present. The emotional body, which utterly mirrors the physical body, is the past, and that past will run through the physical animal energy center. And that is the conflict that you face every single day, that you are trying to meet the present with the emotional past. Just dealing now with the last one, and we go back again. Well, let me tell you a little bit more about the emotional. You know that the emotional body is functioning, and I'll give you 3 examples when it is. If you get moody, if you have a mood swing, oh, I'm feeling great today, I'm really feeling awful today, that is the emotional center operating through the body. If you have what I call false personality, oh, you know, Dan is always so bloody angry all the time about everything. Or, you know, you're always jealous. What's wrong? Or you're always picking on me. These are false personality traits that come through the emotional energy center. And they create this false personality that we have. And that's why we're always this or we're always that. Of course, it's not true. We're not any of those things. But the emotional center does it. And why does it do it? Because it needs to experience that energy again. Another quick example, and I'll talk about sex because we're all grown-ups here. The animal center enjoys sex, and there is nothing wrong with sex. The emotional center likes sexual perversity. That is the difference. I'll give you another example between emotion and animal center. Finally, we can talk a little bit about consciousness, the 0 point. It is the field of infinite possibilities. It is the field where creation actually does occur. Now, okay, we're told all the time, aren't we? And I don't know if you've read people like Eckhart Tolle, or indeed Indian sages and other sages throughout the ages, where they talk about be here now, be present. Well, what isn't present? The animal center is clearly present now. As I say, the desire to go to the toilet, you certainly know that you are present now. Consciousness is present now. It is outside of time and space, as indeed the emotional center is actually outside of time and space. But the emotional center is the one that is not here and now. It is past and it has been. And that is what the sages talk about when they talk about being here and being now. When they talk about being still and being present, that is what we're referring to. The emotional center is also what some people call the soul. But from where I sit, I don't think we have a soul. I'm sorry. But I don't think we have a soul. It is this phantom that exists, and and I can talk a little bit about afterlife if you wish later on, if that's of interest. What I want to do is just preamble for a little while longer, and then I want to throw this open for questions and answers, because that is good philosophy to do so, and I welcome your comments and I welcome your questions. But what has all this got to do with intention? Well, it goes back to that first question, doesn't it? Now we see that map, what actually is intending? from which center are you intending? Now, the animal center does intend all the time. And this is where the confusion says, well, this intention is nonsense, because, if I want something, I can get it. And that is the animal center. If I want to eat a meal and I intend to do something, I would usually get it. It's at a very simple level. Now, the emotional center, you know when that is intended because it always wants more. Now, the animal center wants enough. I want enough. You can't have more than enough at the animal center. I can have enough food, I can have enough sleep, but I can't have more food because soon I will get sick. But the emotional center always wants more. And why do you think it wants more? Because it sits between the animal center and absolute consciousness, and it knows there is more. And it wants more for you. And that is why we always want more. The craving for more comes from consciousness, because it knows there is more. In fact, it knows there is everything. But we want to have more. The more we can do, because we're in time and space, is have more. We can't have everything in time and space. That is not our right at that point. But if you intend from consciousness, and I would suggest to you that this is quite possible, the paradox is this. At the consciousness level, the individual ego, the self-identity, has ceased. And so the paradox is, you are your best intending when you're not intending for yourself. which proves that God does have a sense of humor. Really, as I say, I just want to bring it back to intention, because this afternoon it gets to be fun, but I want you to just think about what we've discussed this morning, and I hope it's going to help in your intention work to become aware. I hope it's been useful to give you an idea of this emotional center. Hopefully it's just made you a little bit more conscious of what actually is going on all the time, and will help you in your intention work, not just here, but when you take this home with you, and where and which center is doing the intending, and what it is that you are intending. Because, yes, I mean, there is no doubt about it. At the animal center, there is evidence that if you do intend that you can have these worldly riches and these things, it does happen. But it happens at a very, very coarse level, because it doesn't happen just with intention at that level. It happens through intention and through action. And it's something that The Secret didn't really point out. If you want to be very rich, yes, you must start with that intention and have a very clear focus of that intention. But if you don't have action to go with it, it isn't going to happen. That's at the coarse animal level. At the consciousness level, it is the place where miracles occur. And I use the term ill-advisedly, but I mean it's a miracle because it occurs outside of time and space. Therefore, it is, to my mind, a miracle. And this happens constantly, consistently, and we will be demonstrating that this afternoon. So I hope this little plan, I mean, when I've had, I've always had a very spiritual bent myself, from a very young age, about 5 or so. And I collected gurus, and I met lots of them, Krishnamurti, Andrew Cohen. A friend of mine was a man called Barry Long. I don't know if any of you have heard of him. I quote him, actually, at the beginning of my little thing here. Then I really did lose my way. I really, really did go into the darkness for the longest time, and I must say, it's probably divine providence that I married Lynne, and she reawakened things for me, and as I hope she has and will for you. But I found, it's a bit like, you think, I wish I had that when I was young. And I wish I had had something like this, so simply explained when I was much younger. It would have been to me very helpful. For you, maybe some people not so helpful, and I'm sorry if that's the case, but I hope for many of you it is. It really does make you conscious. And once you are conscious, then you start being in charge of your life rather than having it driven for you. And as I say, do look out for these little signs in the few weeks ahead. Look to see if you have so many mood swings. Look to see if the same personality traits do keep repeating themselves. I'd be very interested to hear, and I'd be very, very welcome to receive your emails and any thoughts about this, or any comments you have. I'd be delighted to discuss them with you further. As I say, it's a work in progress. It's a piece of philosophy. It's not the Holy Bible, but it hopefully is helpful. Well, thank you very much indeed. I think Lynne would now like to come and... So you did laugh at the comedian at the end as well. Lynne would now like to come and talk, explain a bit more about recruits, volunteers, and this afternoon's fun and games.
Okay. Thank you very much, Brian. I also wanted to just respond to when somebody, the lexicon problem, the problem of words. From our perspective, oftentimes, as Brian says, it's so emotive when we say, there's no soul. What we're actually talking about is, well, yes, there is, because it all depends on how we define it. If we define soul as zero-point field, returning in a sense to unity and decoupling from all of the things that have created separation, then that's a soul, and we truly believe in that. I think what we're talking about, just like we're talking about, many people represent God as a man is sitting on a cloud up there, as some other. We're looking at God as being everything, including us, and that the big problem is perception of us being outside of that, and that's what we're getting back to. So I just want to suggest today too that we try to look at this in the language we're using, because it's probably resonating with you and just being a different way of saying the same thing. But we get tied up in, and everybody uses their own vocabulary. This is ours. And Brian's little map is a simple way of trying to see yourself and what happens. Many people would call the emotional body a soul, because that's the thing that oftentimes lives on too,
It does, yes, the emotional body will, again, I'm going to real theory here, it does survive death, yes.
Yeah.
But because, of course, it does emulate it does follow the shape of the human body. And that's the theory of ghosts, actually, is the emotional body actually hanging around.
Well, and they oftentimes say a ghost is somebody with unfinished business, and that is a perfect definition of emotion, something that requires reliving itself over and over and over again.
And also surprised that it's dead.
So we hope that will be some way of understanding the paradox of what we're really talking about, because we're talking about unity and we're talking about experiencing ourselves as separate. And perhaps this is, a good map for you to use and to determine why. Also, I think Brian wanted to come up with this because we hear from a lot of the current gurus that one must demolish the ego. And the simple question comes about, well, how and why? And so Brian created this map to say, well, if you become conscious of the fact that you've got this emotional body that needs to sort of eat its own tail over and over again, then that's the first step of stepping back one step and seeing yourself as the essence of you as being separate from that, in a sense. And that is just one energy in one center that has that requirement. And perhaps that's a way of living with that, and not necessarily discarding it or discarding the sense of ego, but having it know its rightful place. So that's our theory for this morning. Now we're going to play. And to play, we're going to have a very interesting experiment. We have a challenge here, which is a physical challenge. We'll work it out in the room. But this is what we're going to do. First of all, we need 10 volunteers. We're going to do a thing called message in the bottle. I need 10 of you who are experienced meditators. It would be good if you have a psychic bent. That would be good. But at least having experienced meditators will help, because it will make those messages firmer. We're going to have the 10 meditators take a little baby food jar, which has been filled with water, and I'm going to ask you to send an intention into the water. Now, what we'd like you to do is to use a simple word, but maybe not so obvious. You know, you can use a concept or a word, but you know, we usually get about 5 pieces, you know, PEACE and something like that when we run this experiment. So it would be good if you use something a little bit different. As Brian said, we got barbecue as one of them when we did Chicago, and that was very interesting. Now, the point is, we want you to think of a simple word, a noun, or a simple concept, but something, you know, maybe just a little bit different. Without being impossibly hard. I don't want you to think of, you know, my Aunt Matilda's elbow or something like that, but just something simple. And then we want you to, the 10 volunteers, to take the jar and spend 10 minutes getting into a meditative state and then sending that word into the water, into the jar. So we'll be taking 10 minutes to do that. Then the person will take the jar and tap it on a hard surface 100 times. And I'm going to explain why in a minute. There's a very good scientific reason for all of this. And then go back and do 10 minutes more, sending the word into the jar, and then tap it 100 times. And the third time, send the word into the jar 100 times. When you're doing it, the reason I want an experienced meditator is that if you start thinking about other things, that'll go into the jar too. Because what we're going to do when we come back is then divide you in groups of 10, because there are about 100 people here, 120, maybe groups of 11. And we're going to have you surround each jar, and I'm going to give you a few minutes to get into a meditative state, and I want you to intuit what's in that jar. And then write it down. We're going to give you a paper that has 1 through 10. We're going to create little sort of stations around the room with the 10 jars. And so you will circle around with your group of 11, and you will all get into that meditative state. So remember, there will be 10 groups of 11 at all the different stations. We'll give you a few minutes for each one. We'll play a little bit of meditative music. You'll get into that state. You'll reach out what's in the jar, and I'll explain exactly how when we work on powering up this afternoon before we do it. And then, once you've written that down, you write down the first thing that comes into your mind. The first thing. Don't analyze it. Don't try to figure out what it means. Don't do anything like that. If you have to, just draw it. And then, we're going to have you move on to the next station. So we'll do it at 10 stations in total. And then after our tea in the afternoon, we will compare notes. And you'll be very surprised. What you need to do is this. Take your jar. Think of a word. It can be a noun, an object, something you love, or even a concept, a simple concept like peace, love, something like that. And think the word. Get into a meditative state first, and then think the word in your mind. Visualize it if you want. You can, if you're a pictorial person, rather than a verbal person, imagine an image of the word. If you can do both, think the word and imagine the image. And then imagine yourself, imagine that image coming down through your body, out your heart, and almost like a tendril of a plant being put into the jar. Just imagine yourself just dropping that word into that jar of water. So you can imagine that associative idea too. Do that for 10 minutes. At the end of 10 minutes, and if your mind strays on something else, just bring it back to the word, just like you do in meditation. At the end of 10 minutes, go to a hard surface like this and tap it 100 times, just like this. Just like it's succussion, just like homeopathy. Then, and as I mentioned before, there is some decent evidence to show that that potentiates the message. So then go back, meditative state again, think the word, send it out via your heart into the jar. And, you know, if it helps to imagine the word traveling out into the jar, do that too. 10 minutes, keep in that state, tap it again, then come out, tap it 100 times again, and then do it a third time. 10 minutes, send the word out through your heart again for 10 minutes into the jar, and then tap it 100 times. Then write the word on, take a piece of paper with this too, and we have extra rubber bands if you don't have them. Write the word here. Then fold the paper over like this so that it's folded over, you know, so it can be wrapped around the jar, and then wrap it around and put the rubber band around it. Then we are going to number them. And then when people are finished, we'll then compare notes with what they've got. When they've gone around the room, sending, you know, trying to pull out the word in the jar, then we'll compare notes with what actually was written. Does anyone have any questions? 3 times with 10 minutes each. Don't worry if it's you know, half a minute over or whatever. Just kind of keep your watch handy or be near a clock.
How do we know when 10 minutes is up?
Well, just have a look at a time and say, okay, 3 more minutes. Don't worry if it's 30 seconds over or a minute over. It's not going to matter. It's just a guide. And then the most important thing is that tapping 100 times and trying to keep focused. Okay, we're going to do our little message in a bottle experiment. And as I said, it's a real experiment that is being run at the University of Arizona. But before we do that, I want to talk to you a little bit about how to become a better intender, how to be a better sender. And this, I call this powering up because I discovered, you know, unlike what we think focused mind states are all about, this is not a state of being quiet. This is not a state of quieting your brain down. This is a state of revving everything up to peak attention. And so we're going to talk about that. Many of the studies of, say, Buddhist monks, and these are studies in neuroscience labs. Buddhist monks are being studied all over the world because they represent a brain in bold relief. You know, if a Buddhist monk can do it, then you can really see what happens with the brain because they can do such feats of intention. And they find when a Buddhist monk is sending intention, his brain is operating at a peak speed. In fact, a speed that's never seen except among the criminally insane. It is a state of peak attention where you're attending to something with every pore of your body. So I'm going to run through some things. Now, we can't necessarily do this all today. I mean, there are certain right times, there are certain right places, there's certain mind states and heart states that you'll have to start practicing. But I want you to become aware of them and to use the best ones we can today and the easiest ones we can today, and then to go away and practice. And there are, in your notes, I have a lot of notes about developing your ability to become a better sender and a better receiver. Now, the receiver is a bit of the beginning material, but if you look on, for instance, I believe it's right before Brian's material, if you look on page, I believe it's 5, mental rehearsals, that's a lot of good information there that you can take away, I hope, and practice in learning how to send a very specific and visualized intention. So the first thing, and the most important thing, is just choosing a particular intention space. There's a good reason for this. Now, this can be any old space. It doesn't have to be an altar. You don't have to put Buddhas on it or flowers or anything like that. It can be your office. It can be your bedroom. Any place that you feel really comfortable. And you can decorate it any way you like. The reason I say find a particular intention space is that there's some really good scientific evidence for this. And they're twofold. One is, intention seems to work faster and better when it is part of a mind over matter experiment when it's carried out in the same lab. There have been many experiments of healing, and they find that after a time they begin to work faster and better because they've done it in the same space. Now, many of you are healers in the audience. Has anyone found that when you're using the same healing space, it starts to work better? And you start getting better success. It's the same thing. Now, Dr. William Tiller came up with some interesting evidence in his experiments with intention. He started noticing that they were working, whether or not he had the experimental stuff in the room, that it was starting to become its own space, carrying out its own experiments, whether or not he had the experimental stuff there. So he began to take measurements of the room, and he found some really interesting stuff, that when intention was carried out, it was like, after a time, the room became conditioned, and certain physical properties of the room changed. They're very complicated and very physicsy, but what it comes down to is the zero-point field started becoming more ordered, and it started affecting the temperature and pH of the room, a lot of things like that. So from his work, I infer that when we send intention continually from the same space, in a sense we condition it. We kind of create a sacred space of it. And there have been other studies showing that sacred spaces, like the pyramids or whatever, have a more ordered zero-point field. So I suggest that you create your own space, whatever that is. And the only thing I would suggest is it's good to have a lot of negative ions there. Now, you can install an ionizer, or you can put a lot of plants or a little waterfall, something like that. Now, ions are just a little excess charge. And we know from a lot of data, lots of data, that too much positive charge isn't good for us. Positive charge comes off of civilization, computers, urban traffic, lots of electricity. Negative charge comes from waterfalls, forests, mountain streams, all those sorts of things. So if you decide to do your intention space in your office, just make sure you counteract your computer with some plants, an ionizer, a little mini waterfall, something like that. The reason for this is not only is it good for you physically, it's good for you psychically. There have been studies showing that when people send intention and also try to pick up ESP, that negative ions, a situation of negative ions, so something much more like real nature, actually aids that channel. The next thing I talked about this morning, can we all see this, by the way? Is that hard to see, or is it okay with the lights open? I would want to really close in the light here. Remember that you are part of a bigger energy system. Not only is there a good place, an optimum place for sending intention, there's also an optimum time. As I mentioned earlier, and I whooshed through it, we are profoundly affected by the sun. And the sun has an enormous effect and its activities on our physical symptoms and our system, particularly our heart and brain, but also on our psychic ability. And it boils down to this. The sun is kind of a furious star. And it gives us light, but it also hurls all sorts of unimaginable activity toward us. Solar flares, coronal mass ejections, all these big gaseous things get hurled toward Earth. And if we were to adopt space weather on our planet, it would blow up our planet in an instant. It's that violent. What happens from these explosions is they hit the Earth's geomagnetic shield, and that in turn has a huge effect on us physically and psychically. This is how it boils down. When the sun is calm and not doing much, our heart beats better, we have fewer psychiatric conditions, we have fewer epileptic seizures, and we also can hear ESP better. We have an open channel to ESP, remote viewing, all those kind of psychic channels. On the other hand, when the sun is noisy, when it's hurling lots of stuff toward Earth, we actually have our heart attacks increase, our psychiatric admissions increase, epileptic fits increase, blood coagulates more. We just, in every way, are affected hugely. But also, we're good intenders. We become better intenders with a slightly noisy sun. I guess it must have something to do with that energy affecting our energy to affect physical. So this is a complicated thing, and you can't always pick the perfect time, particularly if you have a health challenge. You know, you have to pick now. But it's just something to keep in mind. If you have a great big intention, it might not be a bad idea to time it right. And those are some websites you can use. One of the best sources for space weather is NOAA, which is a national observation organization in America. And they monitor space weather every day. I was really pleased when we did our first pilot intention experiment because the weather was so furious. It was hailing that night, and we had to hide in a doorway on our way to London to meet with our little intention group. And I kept thinking to myself, this is terrific, because if it's like this, it probably is the result of some sort of violent space weather. Will probably have an effect. So I am one of the only girls you know, when somebody says, what's it doing out there, I usually look at space, outer space. So this is a good one, the SEC, www.sec.noaa.gov/NOAA SCALES, lowercase. You're looking for space weather and solar activity. And its solar activity is measured in AA or K. And you want mid to noisy. You want unsettled weather for intention. For psychic ability, you want calm. And they will note, they'll give you different bands of activity. It's very simply laid out with NOAA. If you check out their site and just go to space weather, and it'll just tell you the geomagnetic index, then that's what you want. This is all spelled out in great detail in the intention experiment and in Living the Field, the master class. So if you have that, don't worry, all of the websites are there. I'll just wait a moment and let you see this. But as I say, this is probably best when you have a particular intention and you can time it right. This certainly has been demonstrated through many, many, many trials with a number of researchers like Dean Radin. Marilyn Schlitz has done a lot of work with this as well. She's done a lot of work, and so has Dean Radin, in looking at people doing physical activity and looking at what the sun's doing. Well, also Stanley Krippner has looked at this too, where he's measured psychic ability and also psychokinetic ability, which is mind over matter, and looked at it in relation to what's happening geomagnetically and found a huge effect. The geomagnetic effects even affect our ability to do physical activity. There have been demonstrations that even things like bowling scores are a lot worse when the sun is noisy. So we are absolutely tied into bigger energies beyond ourselves. It's all part of the sense of unity. Now, when I talk about entering hyperspace, I mean the whole idea of getting into an intense, focused state. Now, that starts with meditative state. Does everyone know how to do meditation? Does anyone not know how to do meditation in the audience? One of the simple ways of starting out with meditation is to get yourself comfortable, and we'll go through this in a lot of our activities this afternoon. Get yourself comfortable and just focus for a few minutes on your breath. Just focus on your breath. Now, lots of people use all kinds of things, mantras and tones, rosary beads. They all have been demonstrated to work very similarly. So it doesn't matter what anchor you use. Breathing is just a perfect anchor. And just focus on the breath. And when stray thoughts come in, you just let them drift, don't fight them, and then go back to the breath. So that's one of the simple ways of just anchoring your mind into avoiding all this kind of mind chatter and just focusing. Another thing to do is a thing called mindfulness meditation, which is a daily practice of being present. Now, Eckhart Tolle talks about becoming present, but a lot of people say, well, how can I do that? I have this busy, frantic, manic life. I've got lots of things to think about. I've got kids. You know, I've got a husband. What do I do? The things you can do, just in your busy, frantic life. is to just be present in the moment and with your five senses, without judgment. This is a lot harder than you think. One of the ways to do it, for instance, is when you're eating your breakfast and you're eating your eggs or eating your cornflakes, is concentrate on what it sounds like. Concentrate and focus on what it smells like. Look and see it for the first time, and look at the exquisite yellowness of cornflakes. Feel it as it goes down your throat. Sense it with all your five senses. Listen to it snap, crackle, and pop. And just really be present with your five senses. Try that little 5-minute exercise through the day. When you're rushing, feel what it's like to be rushing. Smell what it's like to be rushing. When you encounter someone, be present and just sense them as though you see them for the first time, instead of habituating. We're going to talk about this. One of the problems we have is our cognitive desire to fill in the gaps and not really see, and to get in there and think. And one of the ways for learning intense focus is just to be with all your five senses. So that's one practice, mindfulness meditation. But that kind of intense focus will really help you when you're going to send an intention. You'll be able to send it with all your five senses. The other thing is the art of mental rehearsal. And I put Muhammad Ali up here because he was a master of intention. He used every trick in the book. His ability to use affirmation is unparalleled. Who has come up with a better one? I am the greatest. But so do all elite athletes. And they use a form of mental rehearsal, which is rehearsing the activity with all your five senses in real time. That doesn't mean looking at a video of yourself doing it. It means you are imagining yourself in the activity. So whatever it is, if you're ill and you want to feel well, you imagine yourself being well with all your five senses. If you're rowing a boat, you imagine what it feels like to put the oar in the water. You smell the smell of the ocean. All of your five senses are engaged in your mental rehearsal. So that's one thing you want to try practicing. I have a great deal of suggestions in page 5 of your notes. So you'll have that, don't worry. And I also have more information about it and a great deal of science in the intention experiment. But my suggestions for practical applications of it are in my notes. So that's one of the things I'm going to suggest you do today, too, is this whole idea of visualization. When you are receiving, you're going to sometimes pick up the information with your other senses. Or it may come to, a lot of people, when we've done this jar experiment, have picked up the information kinesthetically, their feel. Sometimes it depends on the kind of person you are. I'm a very verbal person. Our youngest daughter is a very kinesthetic person. If music is going, she's moving to the beat. She's a brilliant athlete. She feels through her senses all the time, the feel of things. That is her easiest and most developed sense. If that's yours, you may get a sense impression of something in terms of a feel, of heat. Remember barbecue? We had a couple of people in the audience when they were doing that jar thing. They felt real heat around that jar. Or sometimes we've asked people to send a negative intention into a jar, and people feel evil from that jar. So sometimes there's just that kind of feel. So if you're picking up information, it doesn't have to be as a word. It can be visually. And many remote viewers, like Ingo Swann, say, draw it first, mold it and sculpt it first when you're picking up information, because we get raw data in fragments, in sensory fragments. So you can send or receive in a different sense mode. But even with visualization for illnesses, I mean, there have been many studies looking at the effectiveness of visualization. And there was one researcher called Jean Achterberg who found that she could accurately predict survival rates with cancer victims using visualization based on how good their visualizations were. The most detailed tended to be the survivors. So visualization of any sort, and by visualization, it doesn't have to be a picture. It can be another kind of sense, if that's what works for you better. But the more detailed, the better. If you're a very much a smell person, then if you smell the smell of something in exquisite, and of course, Proust even said, the smell of something brings back incredible memories. That can put people, or listening to a piece of music can bring people back. Auditory memories are huge too. But if that's the kind of person you are, then hear it or smell it instead. But try to form a very complete mental picture in some way. Another thing that we're going to be doing is training your brain to merge tomorrow. We're going to teach you things like limbic resonance. You're going to be doing a little bit of that at the end of today. We found there's certainly many studies showing that when people send intention to each other, their brains begin to merge. Their heart rates begin to merge. A wonderful study called the Love Study in California examined this by having partners send intention to each other. And in each case, one of the partners had cancer. They hooked them up to all, and they found that when one sent intention to the other, their heart waves, their brain waves, their acceptance, every aspect of their began to. It was like two bodies became one. So we are going to be teaching you certain limbic resonance. That's another reason why intention requires compassion. And every intention master talks about sending it out through the heart. It's not a head activity, it's a heart activity. And in fact, there's so much evidence now showing that the heart is the first intelligence of the body. The heart receives material first and sensory input first and sends it up to the brain. I can't do a crash course in compassion, but here's a little suggestion. This is a beautiful quote from, I hope you can read it. It's in, also have quoted it in the intention experiment. It's from the Tibetan book of Living and Dying. And it says, one way of learning about compassion is to open your hearts to suffering. And I'll just read it for you. Don't waste the love and grief it arouses. The moment you feel compassion welling up in you, don't brush it aside. Don't shrug it off or try quickly to return to normal. Don't be afraid of the feeling or embarrassed by it. Allow yourself to be distracted from it or let it run aground in apathy. Be vulnerable. Use that quick, bright uprush of compassion. Focus on it. Go deep into your heart and meditate on it. Develop it, enhance and deepen it. By doing this, you will realize how blind you have been to suffering. I think that is absolutely beautiful and describes perfectly what we might want to do when we see some things on the news that are upsetting. We think about, I don't want to take that in. Maybe this is something to use. Maybe this is some way to develop your own sense of compassion. Instead of being destroyed by it, become an instrument of it. Use it to develop your own sense of compassion and your own call to action. So I just leave that beautiful quote for you as just one little exercise in developing compassion. Now, you probably can't see this, but this is those dearly departed and close to be dearly departed chums who formed a connection, George Bush and Tony Blair. And I put them up because whenever you send intention to someone, I was obviously having a joke here, it's important to form a connection. And these guys did. They decided to blow up a country together. But in all cases, I'm just being facetious. And I do this sometimes in America, and I insult the Republicans. So I usually have another slide that insults the Democrats right after this. But to form a connection with someone, it's important to somehow make that connection. And one of the easiest ways to do it is to just hold their hands. Make a compassionate connection. Or you can exchange an object, or even meditate together. wouldn't it be great if you went to your doctor's office and he said, well, before we get to you, let's just have a meditation together. I just imagine, or if he put his hand on you, you know, God forbid. You know, most practitioners really shy away from that, but that is probably one of the most profound ways and easiest ways to form a connection. It's very important to do this because there is a real congruence of belief that happens. Somebody asked me in the break, is it the person himself having a placebo effect when the intention is sent to him? You know, talking about Daniel, the burn victim. Was it him doing the healing, or was it the group healing him? Was actually it. And the answer is the relationship did it. And oftentimes it's really important for the healer and the healee, or the sender and the receiver, to have a congruence of a belief, to have a connection. And that is included in that is getting the person's permission to send intention. I told you this morning another important element is being specific. And being specific is also visualizing the mental dry run, knowing what you really want, too. Being specific is identifying what it is you want to get from, you know, what is your outcome here? So being clear on what you really want is one of the most important things. You know, ask yourself if you're ill. Dr. John Diamond does this all the time. He's a wonderful healer, and I quote his work all the time because I think he's remarkable. And one of the things he says to his patients all the time is, do you want to be well? And he tests them using kinesiology, because it's remarkable how many people don't really want to be well. And so the first thing you have to do is identify what it is you really want, and then be very specific in what you ask for. I put this slide up for, do you follow through? Because I think this is also important. People think, oh, I do my intention, I send it out to the universe, and I go back to being the absolute slob that I am all the rest of the time, and the universe will take care of me. Now, Napoleon Hill and Wallace Wattles, who were some of the architects of the idea of the law of attraction, manifestation, all talked about follow-through. So you send out your intention, you let it go, but then you do other things that work toward it in your life. So if you really want another job, you send out your intention, but you do all those other things that would get you another job too. So you mobilize yourself as well. If you are ill, you send your intention. Your healing intention is probably the most powerful thing you can do. But you also, you know, stop eating at McDonald's hamburgers and, you know, clean up your act in a number of different ways and look at your toxic thoughts and a lot of other things. So you follow through. So that's just a little reminder that that's in there too. Now, many people have said, is prayer intention? And the studies so far have been terrible because they haven't really been controlled very well. They're not remotely scientific. They've oftentimes done situations where they've had a bunch of ill people who were atheists in the north of America, in, say, the Northeast, prayed for by a bunch of fundamentalist Baptists. And as I told you, you know, if I were an atheist and I were in Massachusetts being prayed for by a fundamentalist Baptist, I'd be pretty pissed off. I'd also think, I must be a no-hoper if I'm being prayed for now. So, you know, this must be the last gasp saloon. So prayer is really not there's nothing we can really gain from prayer studies as to whether intention works. But there is an enormous body of evidence showing that all kinds of healing works. And I like to look at those better because they take it out of an emotive context and just look at pure intention and the ability of one person to send intention to another. And what they've also shown, there have been very interesting studies looking at healers showing that sometimes their healing is off the mark. So these are studies by Dr. Gary Schwartz. I wondered about this. He looked at this and he started trying to figure out what it was. And he did some studies of healers under different conditions and asked them to rate how they were when they were sending healing. And what he found was that when they were well in every way, their healing was more likely to work. So this can't always be the case. Sometimes you're sending intention to get better. But if you have some certain kinds of intentions and they don't involve healing yourself, it might be a good idea to do them on days when you feel particularly on top of your game. I also mentioned to you this idea of similar beliefs. I think it's important for the sender and the receiver to share beliefs. I think that creates the alchemy that's intention. I think it's also important when you are sending, that we all know through these healing studies that thoughts can heal others. It's important to know that negative intention can make you ill. Negative intention in some way on the part of the sender. And who oftentimes does this? Sorry, Anona, this you accepted. Your doctor. Your doctor who tells you how long you have to live. Your doctor who tells you your tumor is inoperable. Your doctor who diagnoses some horrendous thing, sees you, have a few symptoms and says, that could be MS. I have a friend like this. He's had a few TIAs, and now by the time the doctors are through with him, he's got high blood cholesterol, he's a victim for stroke. TIAs are transient ischemic attacks. They're like mini strokes. And while they're wise to look at this, they've got him, they're putting in a pacemaker, they're doing all sorts of things like this. The man is 87 years old, and he's about to be a medical guinea pig. We saw this personally. We saw the power of a hex diagnosis with Brian's mother. I'm going to let him tell you the story of her healing this afternoon. But I can tell you that she nursed breast cancer without telling anyone. She had some bleeding, but no other. Her doctor told her she had very advanced breast cancer. She began and started giving her medication. She began fainting and falling in the street. She would have died in 3 months had we continued on in that course. And I firmly believe what happened was she was given a hex diagnosis. So one of the things I suggest about people is don't let your doctor give you a prognosis. He can go ahead and diagnose you, but don't let him tell you how long you've got. No doctor should have the arrogance to try to figure out who will live and who will die, who will respond to the challenge of healing. No one can do it. People confound the odds all the time. Spontaneous remission occurs across every possible illness. And so no one can say who's going to live and who's going to die. So don't let somebody put that negative thought in your mind. I mentioned earlier today that an important element with all of this is moving beyond the self. And one of the ways that you can do this, a simple way, is understanding that this is not you. That, as Brian says, it's speaking through you, it's speaking through your body, it's speaking through your emotional body, but this isn't really you doing it. And so what many intention masters tell me about is the idea of this surrender, of understanding that you're just the conduit. You're not the water, you're just the hose. And so putting your intention out there, I like that symbol of putting the little cup out and letting it get filled. You put your intention out there and know it will be filled. And then let it go. So I think that sense of surrender is a really important element of it. It doesn't mean you don't carry on your action. It doesn't mean you don't have will in all the other ways you can will toward it, of cleaning up your diet if you're ill or whatever. But with your intention for healing, you put it out and you let it go. And one of the things we want to find, and I want to move on very quickly and into our exercise, is intention individual? Well, our feeling is no. We feel that intention, as I said earlier, requires a community, that intention can work better. In the experiments we've seen, this has definitely been the case, whether it's been with individuals or our intention community. It works better in a community. There is something about that energy there's something about that you are no longer alone that seems to work. So one of the things we're going to be doing right now is to breaking you up into little communities. And as I say, get chummy with these people. They will be your community for the rest of this weekend. And we'd like to start now by I'm going to tell you about the power of the group tomorrow. But I'd like to start out by organizing you in groups of 10. I want to just tell you one more thing before I do, though, which is the one thing that no one ever talks about when they talk about the law of attraction. They never talk about giving back. Everybody talks about getting. No one talks about giving back. But once again, Napoleon Hill and Wallace Wattles always talked about intention being a circle, and you give and you receive. You give and you receive. You don't just take. So that should be part of your intention. Exercise, whatever, in giving in whatever way you can. And part of that is just making your message coherent.